All right, ladies and gentlemen, here's our first little activity that we are going to be doing in our unit, looking at what is more beneficial to be an idealistic person or a realistic person, okay? And how we're going to set all of this up, like I said before, is we're going to be looking at a couple of people, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And what I need to do today is I need to give you all just a little bit of background into a time that's called the Jim Crow era. Okay, in the Jim Crow era, if I just run like a quick little Google search on Jim Crow era, which I've done, the Jim Crow era was essentially the time after the Civil War up into the Civil Rights Movement, where black men and women in the United States were quote unquote free, but weren't actually free because there was lots of laws that discriminated against black men and women. So we've got a lot of images in here of like colored only drinking fountains, where if you were black, you had certain drinking fountains that you could go into. We've got there was waiting rooms at bars where if you were white, you could go into the bar, but if you were not, if you were a black man or woman, you had to go into a different bar. All right. We also have a lot of examples of extreme violence against black men and women during this time period. Okay. And what I need to do to get you to before we can really understand Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and kind of their philosophies, one's an idealist, one's a realist. We've got to know a little bit of background of what was going on at the time that these two lived. And I know that you all have learned probably a whole lot in the past about like the civil rights movement and things like that. So I'm gonna hit on it really just kind of like the high points right here. And remember, this whole thing, what I'm going to be asking you to do in this Google Doc is essentially you've got some different videos. Like the first video is about police brutality in the time of Jim Crow. This time where black men and women were definitely not treated anywhere near equally, especially in like the southern part of the United States. But I'd say throughout most of the United States, they weren't treated equally. In the time of Jim Crow. So in each one of these, you're essentially going to be asked to watch the video that I have up here. So the first one's about police brutality. The second one's about lynching. The third is about a church bombing. And essentially what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to watch the video, and then I want you to think about if you were a black man or woman living at the time of Jim Crow, and this is something that happened in your community or happened to somebody you know, or you were in the situation, how would you respond? All right. And then I just want you to, and there's no right or wrong answers there. I just want you to think about how would you respond if you were in that situation? And then I want you to think about if you were responding that way, is your response more like an idealistic or realistic response? Okay. And just remember, okay, kind of the difference between the two. An idealistic person imagines a better world and acts like they want a better world right now. So they very much like look forward into the future and they say, okay, how is what I'm doing right now going to impact the future? All right. Some people, they look into the future an awful lot. Some people, not so much. And it's not right or wrong. It's just the way that it is. A realistic person on the other side, they see the world for as it is right now. They don't worry too much about the future. They focus really more on like right now in the present. So it's not necessarily how is my decision going to impact the future. It's more of like, how can I make my position better right now? Okay, so with that, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background in all of these different things. I'm going to take like another maybe 2 minutes. Okay, so the first part, during Jim Crow, there's lots of examples of police brutality, especially against black men and against black men and women in the time of Jim Crow. So you've got examples here of like there was a thing called Bloody Sunday where a bunch of peaceful protesters essentially were walking down the street in Selma trying to protest racial injustice, and the police literally like grabbed them and started beating the black men and women that were just literally walking in the middle of the street. There's examples of similar things like this in St. Louis, Missouri. There's examples of like in Birmingham, Alabama, the police, they did things like they took their canine units and were training their canine units to attack anybody that was peacefully protesting. And there's examples of that happening there. All right. So some not necessarily great things going on with police brutality. There's also some things going on called lynchings, where essentially A lot of these times it was like street justice, that if the white people in a town thought that a black person in town broke a law or did something illegal, they would take it upon themselves, essentially go find that black person and hang them, kill them in a tree in the middle of the road where everyone could see. All right. So, like, there's lots of pictures that you can find with a bunch of white people that are standing looking up. Some are even like, there's pictures of them cheering of a black person who has been hung in the tree, not because they got found guilty of a crime, but just because they simply thought that this person committed a crime. All right. So, what I've got is I've got a video actually from a Denzel Washington movie called The Great Debaters about that. Okay, so that's one of the videos that you've got, and the last video is all about some like church bombings and just bombings in the Jim Crow era, because there's lots of examples of like white supremacists going around and bombing like black churches, black businesses. There's a place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where it was called like Black Wall Street, where there was a whole bunch of like black businesses that were all really successful in the same area, and a white supremacist group went and bombed like that whole location, and destroyed a whole bunch of black businesses because they didn't want to see black people be wealthy, essentially. Okay, so your job right now is to kind of watch these. I've got just short YouTube videos right here, and then answer the question where I essentially want you to say, if you were in this situation, how would you respond? And do you think that's an idealistic response or a realistic response? And the reason why we're doing that is we're going to start here on Thursday learning about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, because they both responded to situations just like you're going to be watching and learning about, and we're going to look at how they responded to. All right, so that's your job for today. I'm not at school today, so I can't Zoom, but I am at home. If you've got any questions, you can email me, that sort of stuff. Thanks.